The story of What Remains of Edith Finch is told through a very interesting narrative structure that makes it stand out as an example of a well-built narrative. This narrative is conveyed to the player through both visuals and text-based format, as you explore the history of the Finch family through the eyes of the titular Edith Finch. The medium and methods in which the story is told make it so that the player has to piece together the narrative as they encounter the various stories throughout the game, with even the meaning behind the game's title not being revealed till the very end of the game. The narrative of this game showcases the power of narrative in the medium of video games, and how the medium can allow for more complex and involved narratives. The narrative of the game is told to the player in two main forms. First is through direct narratives given by the various narrators throughout the game, through visual text that shows up on screen along with voice recordings of the various texts. This combination of text and audio is your constant companion throughout the piece, delivering the majority of the story with the other form filling in the details left unanswered by the text and narration. The second form is experienced through interactive visual elements as you dive into various texts presented to you throughout the piece as you play through the stories of various members of the Finch family left behind in various forms throughout the house the game takes place in. These visuals help to fill in incorrect details that are either not directly explained or are the result of the unreliable narration seen throughout the piece. An early example of this dichotomy between visuals and text can be seen in one of the first major stories the player dives into as part of the game. As a part of the game, the player enters the room of a child who died young where they encounter her diary and read their final entry. The entry discusses how she was sent to bed without dinner and the unending hunger she is now experiencing as a result. As the player, you control the child as she wanders around her room, mindlessly consuming everything edible she can find before eventually giving up and going to sleep, where she experiences hunger-induced hallucinations. The sequence ending with her imagining herself as a monster underneath her own bed, waiting to eat her once she falls asleep. At first glance, having only the text to go off of, the story doesn't stand out as particularly explanatory of how the child passed, rather alluding to this fantastical idea of her being eaten by a monster. However, the visuals for this story fill in these blanks and explain the reality of what happened. In the player-controlled segment, as you wander around as the child looking for food, you are required to consume some bright red berries growing along a windowsill. The child doesn't specifically call out the berries, simply saying, "I ate a lot of things that night." However, these seemingly inconspicuous berries are visually seen to be a poisonous form of berry that causes hallucinatory effects upon consumption. The child, being unaware of this, consumes them and is as such poisoned and experiencing hallucinatory effects as seen through the extremely vivid dreams she describes in the entry, dying later that evening as a result of the poison. While the text itself tries to present this more fantastical and unrealistic version of events, it is through the visuals that the reality of the situation is truly grasped and understood. As I briefly touched on earlier, this game features a very prominent framing device in the form of Edith reading stories about her family through various forms, with the visuals taking over to reflect the point of view of the subject in that specific story. These story dives act as a framing device for all stories seen throughout the game, and are used to differentiate the narrative currently being told in both time and space throughout various points in the game. An early example of this framing device in action can be seen the second you open the game. Upon startup, the first image you see is through the eyes of a character riding a boat towards an island. As you look down, you see a weathered journal and you open it. As you turn the pages, the narration for the main plot of the game begins, with the words fading in visuals as you take control of Edith Finch, who you then play through the point of view as she recounts the day she returned to her childhood home after becoming the last surviving member of her family. This story is told through the first-person perspective, but includes several points where Edith specifically says things like, "Then I found out about you," or "I don't know if I should tell you these stories." This is because the entire game is framed around the journal the late Edith is writing to her unborn son, explaining the history of their family to him. This son is the person on the boat who you control in the first few seconds of the game, and the journal you open acts as a framing device for the remainder of the story until the final few seconds of the game. What I consider to be one of the most important parts of the narrative is the interactive element of the story. The action of physically taking over the point of view of a subject in the story and gaining direct insight into their thoughts and actions make you feel much more connected and gives you a deeper understanding of them than text alone could. A prime example of this comes from the second to last story dive of the game, centering around the main character's older brother. The narrative of this particular story is told through a letter from the brother's therapist to the mother after his sudden death. The therapist discusses the split in the brother's mind that had developed as a result of the monotony of his job at a fish packing plant, where he did the same basic motion all day. This is hammered home to you as the player as you take on the perspective of the brother living through the job in the plant. As the story continues, the therapist explains how the brother's mind would begin to wander, and in turn we as the player are given the ability to control his wandering mind with half the game's controls, while the other half continues to perform the basic actions required to do the brother's job. As this continues, however, the monotonous controls for the job become second nature, and the secondary controls, which can move a colorful character around the screen, become much more interesting and engaging, directly mimicking the experience of the brother as his mind wanders at work. Over time, the more dreamlike visuals of the fantasy world being formed in the brother's head, which initially occupy a small portion of the screen, completely envelop the screen as both you as the player and the brother as a character completely forget about the monotonous job at the fishery and become much more engaged in this fantasy narrative unfolding before you. This ends with you controlling the brother as his fantasy world completely overrides the reality of the fishery and in a delusional state sticks his head into a device intended for cutting the heads off of fish before processing, killing him instantly. The reality of the situation dawns on you as you control the brother. Both him as the character and you as the player became so enveloped in the colorful dreamlike world of the fantasy that reality completely slipped past you, resulting in the worst outcome. While the experience would still be emotional if told simply through text, the interactive nature of this specific story makes the experience harrowing and gives you so much more insight into the brother's mind as you actively experience the monotony in his life and the much more interesting world of his fantasies. While you can just explain the mind of a character, the experience of making you physically deal with and understand the internal struggles of a character through action is much more enveloping. What Remains of Edith Finch stands as an example of how narratives in the medium of video games can be used to tell more involved and complex stories. Throughout all of the various stories in What Remains of Edith Finch, one element that rings true across all of them is the ability to instantly draw the player into the story and narrative the game sets out to tell. The story of What Remains of Edith Finch defies the standard narrative structure presented in novels and opts instead to forge its own form of narrative that can only be told in its chosen medium, creating a narrative structure that allows us as the audience to experience events directly through the eyes of the characters.